To VIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at viamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. VIA Media, your way.
All right. Good morning, everyone. We're in session 5 of our course, Sheroes of Resistance, African women who fought against various forms of oppression, from slavery to colonialism to neo-colonialism. So we're going to jump right into it, and we're continuing our discussion that we started last week by looking at women from the Akan cultural group that makes up, what's now modern-day Ghana, a little bit of Togo, and how they resisted various forms of oppression from the period of the 1600s going into the early 20th century. So last week, we looked at Nanny of the Maroons. We looked at the Queen of Kingston, Akua. We looked at others who fought against slavery in the Caribbean, and other Akan women that fought in Suriname and Barbados and Guyana and various places, all for liberation. So we're continuing in that discussion because there's so many examples of women from this cultural area that led resistance movements. And the two that we're going to talk about today, you perhaps have heard of. One you probably definitely heard of, and one, if you're familiar with African history from Ghana, you definitely heard of. So we're going to be talking about Harriet Tubman, and we're going to be talking about Yaa Asantewaa. And you may be wondering, okay, what does Harriet Tubman have to do with Akan women? Well, her ancestry goes back to that region of Ghana, or the region of Africa that we now call Ghana. So this is what we're going to get into today. All right. So we're continuing our discussion of Africans that were taken to the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. So we're going to start with slavery today, and then we're going to move to talk about the onset of colonialism in what's now Ghana in the late 1800s. And we'll talk about the connection between these two things because they're not disconnected phenomena. Slavery and colonialism blend right together, and we'll talk about that. So in Abura, Ghana right now, there is this statue of Harriet Tubman. Her descendants used the oral tradition of their family as well as records to recognize that Harriet Tubman's grandmother came from this region of Africa. Her grandmother's English name was Modesty. I can't remember what her African name was, or if it's even in the record, but the slave masters named her Modesty, and she was from this region of Africa. So a couple of... please mute folks if they're talking. The folks in Ghana honored her with this statue, and they invited some of her descendants, people that were Harriet Tubman didn't have any children. These were great nieces and nephews that came to the honoring of this statue that you can go and visit today in Abura, Ghana. So this is the connection. And we see through Harriet Tubman's life a lot of the same types of fight and resistance that we saw in Nanny of the Maroons, that we saw in Akua, and we saw all these other Akan women who resisted enslavement. So a little bit about Harriet Tubman. That's not her birth name. She was born Arminta Ross in Eastern Shore, Maryland in 1820. Large family. They were largely enslaved on the same plantation or neighboring plantations. During her life, her early life, she suffered a very particular instance of abuse where the slave master had threw a weight and it hit her in the head and almost killed her. But for the rest of her life, she would have seizures and black out because of this blow. But the interesting thing about this, when she blacked out, she would often receive visions. Even when she didn't have these spells, she would receive visions. She had a very strong spiritual connection. And like we've mentioned with these other resistance movements, spirituality is a key aspect of Africans fighting for liberation. And we've been having this discussion about the use of traditional African spirituality and Christianity and Islam in these struggles. Harriet Tubman had a strong connection to the Christian tradition. She believed that all of her actions were guided by the Holy Spirit, and she had direct communication with God, who guided her in all the things that she did. So growing up in that enslaved environment, and like many enslaved people, the love of family and the support of family was key to maintaining sanity in an insane environment. And the thing that enslaved people feared most, more than whippings, more than other forms of brutalization, was the separation of families, both biological families as well as the families that were created through the shared experience of plantation life or life in enslavement, or just being in enslaved communities. Not everybody lived on plantations. So think about that. We talked about it last week, the idea of shipmates, malungos, those people that survived the Middle Passage. And even if they weren't biologically family, even if they weren't from the same ethnic groups or nations in Africa, that formed a familiar bond. Well, those types of bonds transcended not only the ships, but also in those communities of enslaved people. So that was really important. And this is the catalyst for Harriet Tubman actually escaping enslavement. When her master died, with enslaved people being property, whenever a master would die, it was a tenuous time for enslaved people. Because if the family of the master wasn't doing that well, they always had the option of selling off the enslaved property so that they could, pay debts or do whatever they needed to do, which meant the separation of families. And this is also during a period. So at this time, we're talking about the late 1840s. It's also the period where slavery is expanding in the United States. A lot of new states are being created. And it's really interesting how all of this connects, because the United States doubles in size with the Louisiana Purchase. This is when Thomas Jefferson negotiates with France to get the areas between the Mississippi River and points further west, going all the way to the areas that the Spanish control. So with that purchase was done by France largely as a result of losing Haiti. So we talked about the Haitian Revolution. When France lost Haiti, Haiti was the most prosperous colony in the Americas. France needed an influx of cash. So they sold the Louisiana Purchase to the United States for a lot cheaper than it should have been, and it doubled the size of the US. So you have that. So the result of Africans getting liberation indirectly led to Africans getting more oppressed in the US. But it also led to Africans getting freedom in places like Colombia and other places in South America as well. There's a whole connection between the liberator of South America, Simon Bolivar, and the Haitians. That's another discussion for another time. So when that happened, new territories were opened up in the West, and battles were occurring within the United States between the Northerners who wanted slavery to end, some because of altruistic reasons. They just hated the institution of slavery. I mean, you got some good white folks that hated the institution of slavery. We're going to talk about probably the greatest ally black folks ever had in a second. And then, of course, you had a lot of free black people that wanted slavery to end. They didn't want it to expand into these new territories. But then you had the Southern planters, who at the turn of the 19th century, beginnings of the 19th century, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. And this changed things. This made cotton even more profitable than it had ever been, because it became easier to separate the fibers of the cotton plant from the seed, which is incredibly hard to do. So when you have this machine that can do this on a mass scale, it made cotton production incredibly profitable. And cotton exhausts the soil. So you can't plant cotton year after year after year on the same plot of land. You need new land and let that soil rest and regenerate without, exhausting it, because then the land will become useless. So new territories were needed for cotton production. New territories were given or granted because of the Louisiana Purchase. So as all these new states were being created, Africans were being moved from the upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky and Delaware and North Carolina, to the deep south and points west as new states were being created. Harriet Tubman's family is in this process. You know, the slave master dies, the family of the master says, well, we need to settle some debts, we do some things, we're going to sell. The rumor was we're going to sell these people in the family. And Harriet Tubman's family said, all right, this is the last straw. Remember, we talked about this before. During enslavement, enslaved people didn't view themselves as property, even though the slave masters did. So even though they were in the condition of enslavement, they still believed that they had rights that need to be upheld. We talked about this last week when we talked about Angelique. When her master died, she was under the impression that she was going to be free or allowed to leave with this Frenchman once he died. And then when she found out that that wasn't going to be the case, this is when she rebelled. Or when food rations are cut, or any promise that enslaved people think that they have with the master when it's broke, that often leads to, all right, that's the last straw, we're rebelling. In this case, Harriet Tubman and a few of her brothers said, all right, they're going to try to separate us. That's a fate almost as bad as death. Let's run away. And Harriet Tubman was in an advantageous geographical environment because she's in Eastern Shore, Maryland. If she goes a state up, she's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had been one of the earlier states to abolish the slave trade. So if she made it to Pennsylvania, and this is 1849 when her and her brothers are talking about escaping, if she makes it to Pennsylvania, particularly to Philadelphia, where there's the largest free black community in the United States, with a number of people that were formerly enslaved, or they were the children of people that were formerly enslaved. There's a whole network of people in Philadelphia, people like William Steele, who's considered the father of the Underground Railroad, that are there that could help you get freedom and get you either further north or to Canada. But at this point, in 1849, most people are just trying to get to the north. Canada's going to come in the picture in a second. So they decide they're going to escape. They're going to try to make their way to Philadelphia, to make their way to Pennsylvania. Right before they're about to leave, her brothers get scared and say they don't want to go. They don't want to take, they'll take the risk of, family being separated, or we'll see what we can work out down here, but we don't want to try to escape. So Harriet Tubman had to make this escape in 1849 by herself. So she's around 29 years old, and she goes from Maryland to Pennsylvania, and she's led by the Holy Spirit. She goes, she figures out how to get there, and she escapes. She gets to Philadelphia. She works a little while in Philadelphia, but then she realizes that her freedom is meaningless unless it's connected to the freedom of her family. So she starts making preparation to go back and get her family members, even those brothers that wouldn't go the first time. She goes back for them. And she frees her family. And then she realizes that it's not enough that she just frees her family. She's going to try to free as many African people as possible. This is young Harriet Tubman. It's a recent photo that was found maybe a few years ago. And I like using this one because oftentimes we see the pictures of older Harriet Tubman, which is cool. But younger Harriet Tubman, this is what she looked like, around the time that she had escaped enslavement. So Harriet Tubman goes back, and she has a route that she takes. And eventually she goes further and further north, and eventually goes to St. Catharines, Canada. And she has this yearly cycle that she does where she raises money through working as a domestic in New York, sometimes in Canada. And then in the spring, she makes her way down south. She infiltrates enslaved communities and then frees people. She lets the people know, I'm here. And Moses is here. We're going to lead you to freedom. Traditionally, the numbers have been, she made 19 trips and freed about 300 people through this cycle of working as a domestic, as a maid, raising money, then going to the South, infiltrating the community, telling people that she's there, alerting them, and then leading them to freedom. Every time she does this, she becomes more and more wanted in the South. She's the most wanted person in the United States. The bounty on her is incredibly high. Yet she's so courageous that she just keeps doing this. She can't be stopped. She is imbued with this spirit of courage that few people have. So you have to imagine what this is like for her. The most wanted woman in America, going into the South, using all these forms of disguise and trickery to get into these communities. She would often walk stumped over to make her appear older than what she looked. And she would wear clothes to make herself look older. So, slave masters, they're just walking by, they just see this old lady, they don't pay her no mind, but it's really Harriet Tubman. She tells a story. She didn't write an autobiography, but she did a lot of interviews in her later years, talking about her exploits. She tells a story that one time she actually passed her old slave master, I think the son of her old slave master, and he didn't recognize her because of how well disguised she was. She had a trick that she used where she would carry a chicken, and if she felt like somebody was if she needed to have a distraction, she had a string on the chicken's foot and she would pull it to make the chicken make noise and everything like that, to distract while something else was going on. She had all types of maneuvers like this in order to get people to freedom. And I love talking about Harriet Tubman. And she made sure that people didn't turn around either, because she learned a lesson from her brothers. Like, if we're going, we're going. Like, you're going to get all of us captured if you decide to turn back. So she had a gun for two reasons. She had a gun to protect the group that she was leading to the north, but that gun could also be used to remind people, oftentimes men, that, hey, we decided to go on this journey, there's no turning back. So either you come in like this or I'm gonna leave you laying here. Luckily, she didn't have to shoot nobody. But that's what she did. This is why she was slated to, I don't know if the United States is still going to do that, but she was slated to be on a $20 bill before Trump became president, because you don't get a story like this often. There aren't words to describe the courage of Harriet Tubman. So most people know her for that. And when you hear tales of Harriet Tubman, and you hear the history of Harriet Tubman, people just kind of stop it there. That it's remarkable. She freed 300 people, 19 trips, and doing all this, which is great. But there's so much more to Harriet Tubman as a resistance leader. One tale in particular. So as I mentioned, 1849 is when she escaped enslavement. 1850 is when the United States enacted the Fugitive Slave Act. And this is what really caused a lot of people to go to Canada, because the Fugitive Slave Act basically said this. Before the Fugitive Slave Act, if you got to a state like Pennsylvania, you were basically free. The Fugitive Slave Act said now federal authorities and other folks have the duty, the obligation to return you back to enslavement, and could deputize people in the North to catch you and bring you back to enslavement. So through this process, a lot of even free people were being kidnapped and taken back into enslavement, even if they had never been enslaved. They were put in enslavement if they couldn't prove that they were free, or have somebody prove that they were free. So a lot of insecurity among Africans after 1850. So many of them realizing that even if you were in Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts or Michigan, it was better or Ohio, it's better to go to Canada, because Canada didn't have a law of extradition. If you made it to Canada, then you were really, really free. So she starts making her operations in St. Catharines. But I tell that part of the story because of a very interesting event that happened right before the Civil War, the battle for Charles Nell. Charles Nell was an African that was enslaved in Virginia, but he made his way through the Underground Railroad to New York. It was found out that he was in New York, Troy, New York. It was found out that he was in Troy, New York. And at the time, Harriet Tubman just happened to be in Troy. So this is one of those things where Harriet Tubman say, it's because of God that she was there. She was there to visit family. She didn't know this was going on, but God led her to Troy, New York. So she's at Troy, New York. Charles Nell gets arrested by the authorities because, he's an escaped African. They found him that he was there because his wife was there. He wasn't going to go to Canada right away because his wife was in Troy, New York. So they arrest him and they have him locked up in the courthouse. Harriet Tubman finds out about it. The rest of the Black community finds out about it. And they storm the building that he's being held at. And there are various reports about what happened, but essentially one report has it that a riot took place outside, and Harriet Tubman goes to the window of the room where Charles Nell is being held, and she tells him how to climb out of the window to come down to freedom. And in the ruckus of the riot, he escapes. So that's one tale, and he escapes to Canada. Another version of it is he actually escapes twice, and both of these things had to do with Harriet Tubman. He's arrested, he's put in the building, there's an event like a riot, Harriet Tubman tells him to escape. He escapes, but then he's caught again, and he's arrested again, taken to a different courthouse. And then long after that, Africans storm that courthouse again and release him, and then he makes his way to Canada, and then ultimately somebody buys his freedom. They pay the master that he had in Virginia, I think it was like $600, I don't know how much that is in today's money, and they bought his freedom, so it was over, so he was ultimately free. But this shows what Harriet Tubman was going to do, because this was a fight, and Harriet Tubman told later, interviewer that she actually picked orders and carried them a ways to freedom before they were attacked by the police. And there's reports that she was fighting the police and there was shooting and back and forth. So she's free. I mean, she could have just left this alone. She didn't have to get involved in this. But this just shows how much Harriet Tubman hated the institution of enslavement and hated seeing her people oppressed. That she and the rest of these free Africans would fight to get this guy out of re-enslavement in New York. This is a tale that's not often taught about Harriet Tubman. And I think, and I'm not completely sure about this, but I think there's something behind that. You know, escaping enslavement, courageous, is not a confrontational act. You know, it's escape and you're leaving. But when you teach the history of confrontation and you talk about Harriet Tubman like this, and then we think about what we're doing for our brothers and sisters that are wrongfully incarcerated now in 2020. And many of us won't even write a letter to the senators or to a governor to help release our political prisoners, people like Mumia Abu-Jamal. Actually, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, Tupac's stepfather, is just getting released from jail. But there are so many political prisoners that were locked up during the Black Power movement and afterwards that few people even know about or won't even take the time to write a letter to the senator. But at this time, being the most wanted woman in America and these other free Africans that are in the vicinity, that have a lot to lose because many of them are escaped, or many of them are children that could easily be arrested and taken back to enslavement, separated from their families. They were willing to fight, to confront the injustice head on, to go to the building where their brother was locked up and release him from prison. So teaching that type of history of confrontation is incredibly important. Probably the most important aspect of Harriet Tubman as a freedom fighter actually occurs during the Civil War. And it's remarkable how much this is not taught in history classes. So not long after the release of Charles Nell, actually right before this, Harriet Tubman meets another individual, an individual by the name of John Brown. John Brown was a white man that hated slavery with a passion. And John Brown felt that he was guided by the Holy Spirit and guided by God to fight against enslavement through any means necessary. And when people talk about European allies and white allies, he's the best example of an ally. He was willing to give his life and to fight other European people on behalf of the rights of African people. John Brown met Harriet Tubman, and John Brown was planning a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This is right before the Civil War. John Brown had fought in Kansas. Kansas was a state, like I mentioned, when those new states were being created as a result of Louisiana Purchase, Kansas was one of them. And the United States had a law that, you know, we will go with whatever the majority of the people in the state say. If they want it to be a slave state, it'll be a slave state. If they vote for it to be a free state, it'll be a free state. So you had all these forces from the South and forces from the North come to Kansas to fight it out to see if this is going to be a slave state or a free state. And John Brown was one of these forces, and it was called Bleeding Kansas. He went there, they were fighting the forces of slavery, and Kansas ended up being a free state. But John Brown met Harriet Tubman, and he asked her, he also asked Frederick Douglass, would they accompany him on his raid of Harper's Ferry? He was going to raid the U.S. Armory at Harper's Ferry and kind of kickstart a civil war before the Civil War actually started. He was going to arm enslaved Africans. He had a group of his sons, some free black people that were with him, and this is what he was going to do. When he met Harriet Tubman, he said this of Harriet Tubman. He said, Harriet Tubman is more man than any man I've ever met. And he didn't mean that disparagingly. John Brown meant it as in terms of her courage, her willingness to sacrifice, her fight, her ability to fight, that she had more courage in her than any man he had ever known. John Brown referred to her as General Tubman. Every time he met her, he called her General Tubman. This is the amount of praise that he had for her. And she had praise for John Brown and everything that he was doing. She didn't accompany him on his it was the ill-fated raid of Harper's Ferry. He was captured and he was executed, and the hanging of John Brown became a seminal event in African American history. People remember that. He's a great martyr of this battle against enslavement. And in fact, once the Civil War and everything was over, Harriet Tubman named her home for formerly enslaved African elders the John Brown Hall in remembrance of John Brown. But anyway, when the Civil War actually did kick off, at first, President Lincoln and the other leaders of the North, they thought this was going to be a short engagement. The South had seceded from the Union. The North just wanted to get the South back into the United States. They thought it was going to be a short thing, and they didn't want Black people involved in the fighting. They wanted it to remain a white man's war. That's until things started going south for the North. The North soon realized after the Confederacy was winning battle after battle that they were going to need some support. The North first instituted a draft of white folks, and white folks were like, no. In New York, particularly a lot of immigrants. If you watch the movie Gangs in New York, talks a lot about this. There were riots in New York because the Northerners were like, I don't care if South Carolina is not a state anymore. Why would I go fight? This means nothing to me. So no, I don't want to go. And then there was the belief that Africans would be free as a result of this war. A lot of abolitionists were pushing this because they said, let's fight, because if we retake the South, then we can force them to end slavery. So a lot of white immigrants and a lot of white folks in New York were like, I don't like Black people, so why would I go fight for Black people? So don't think the North was just some paragon of racial equality. It has never been, and still isn't. Places like Boston and Philadelphia, they didn't have no love for Black people. So they're like, why would I go fight for Black people? So the North was struggling. So finally, Abraham Lincoln was forced to allow Africans to fight. And this is where we get the 54th Regiment out of Massachusetts and others, because there were Black folks who were itching to fight. Because they knew if we take over territories in the South, we will liberate those Africans, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And that's another piece of history that needs to be, make sure that we get that straight. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was to weaken the South. It was not because he had a necessarily love for Black folks. Lincoln said, if I could end this war without freeing one slave, I would. That's Lincoln's words. The Emancipation Proclamation said, rebellious states have a certain amount of time to come back into the Union. If not, then the enslaved Africans in those states will be free. Now that weakens the South for a number of ways. One, it hits them economically. Because remember, every enslaved person represented at least $500 in their back then. So you can imagine how much that is. So it's billions of dollars in property that is lost overnight. And then the labor that comes with enslavement, of course. So it was going to hit the South economically and militarily, because once the propaganda got out that, you know, you're now free, and if you get to the Northern armies, you're free, so many Africans just went basically on strike, just stopped working when they heard news that this was happening. And it led to rebellions, even though Africans had been rebelling since 1526 in the United States. They've never stopped. You know, right before the Civil War, there were rebellions in Texas. If I go back to this map and show you, these are just some of the major rebellions that have happened in the United States. So Africans had been rebelling. They weren't waiting for Lincoln to issue them anything. But anyway, when this did, Harriet Tubman joins the war effort. And she joins first, she goes to the Sea Islands in South Carolina to help with the Africans that were there. Now, this was an area where tens of thousands of Africans had been enslaved. And when the Civil War fought, it was one of actually the first places that the Union retook. And when they did, the slave masters just left. And, these Africans needed support in terms of healthcare and other things. So the Union troops were there to provide that. And Harriet Tubman was one of these people. She raised funds. She operated as a cook, as a nurse. And while she was there, she also operated as a spy. And this is the deep South. This is South Carolina. So when hostilities really picked up, and the Union was creating a strategy to really take South Carolina, they knew this strategic Combahee River was incredibly important to the Confederates. There were a lot of munitions stored there. There were a lot of wealthy plantations. And if they captured this area, it would really, really weaken the Confederacy in South Carolina. So they turned to Harriet Tubman. She did reconnaissance of this entire region, meaning she got in disguise, dressed like an old black lady, and went out and talked to the enslaved population. Because the South, even in their war effort, was incredibly lazy. They relied on enslaved labor to hide their munitions and to do these things. So while they're fighting to keep these people enslaved, they're also using enslaved labor as part of their war effort. So the Africans knew where everything was. They knew where the guns were. They knew where the explosives were along the river. They knew so many things. They knew the weak points. So she got all this information. And then while she's getting this information, she's telling the people, look, a night's going to come where I'm going to liberate all of you. So just be ready. So she gets this information. She takes it back to the Union general. Now, she is a non-commissioned officer. She has no rank in the Union Army. But essentially, she created this entire operation. But there is a general that's nominally in charge, even though she runs everything, basically. The United States will recognize that later. So the night of June 1st, 1863 comes. And this is the night that the Union boat and attack these plantations. And the Africans run to the boats as they were instructed by Harriet Tubman. She had organized this so that in this one night, June 1st, 1863, she liberated over 700 enslaved Africans along this river. 700. So we give Harriet Tubman a lot of praise for her 19 trips to the South, freeing 300 people. She more than doubled that in one night. She freed 700 people through her own reconnaissance and her own organization of the Combahee River Raid. She's the first woman in U.S. history to lead a combat mission. Not black woman, first woman in U.S. history to lead a combat mission. And it was incredibly successful. And she told a later biographer who interviewed her that it was like the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea when she saw all these Africans emerging from these plantations and coming to the boats of the Union Army and becoming liberated. And then when those Africans became liberated, a lot of those men would then join the Union Army to increase the ranks of the Union Army. When Africans got involved in the Civil War, that's when the tide started to turn, and the Union ultimately won, and then slavery was eliminated. Now, let me go back to the Emancipation Proclamation, because that's important. I forgot to mention it. It just applied to the rebelling states. If you look at this map, going back, the states you see, let me go to this one. Yeah, okay, I'll go to this one. There were states with slaves that did not join the Confederacy. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky. These were border states. They stayed with the Union, so they got to keep their slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't about ending slavery. It was just about ending slavery in the rebelling states. It's not until the 13th Amendment that slavery is ultimately abolished in the United States, except if you get locked up, then you can still be a slave. That's what the 13th Amendment says. Gee, slavery is over unless you get put in the penitentiary, then you can still be a slave. So that's really important when you think about that, the Emancipation Proclamation. But anyway, she does this, and this leads to the one of the battles that ultimately will lead to the end of the Civil War in 1865. But her work wasn't finished. After the Civil War, she went up to New York, Auburn, New York, where she lived with her family members and a whole community of newly freed Africans. And as they begun to age, she realized that these people need to be taken care of. They didn't have any retirement plans, and they had spent most of their life working for somebody else. So she said, these elders in our community deserve to live their final years in comfort. So she organized the John Brown Hall and raised funds for it and gave speaking talks around the country to raise money for it, so that these formerly enslaved African people could have a space to live their final days in comfort. So it's a retirement home, old folks home for formerly enslaved people. So she spent a lot of her years building that and doing different things in the community. The last thing I'll say about Harriet Tubman, she also laid the foundation for the Black Women's Club movement that would exist in the first half of the 20th century and expand all the way to Canada. We got the Montreal Black Women's Club movement, which I'll talk about probably in a few weeks. But in 1896, the first national Black Women's Association, the National Association of Colored Women, was founded. Harriet Tubman was at the founding of this organization in 1896. It's almost like she was passing the baton to the next generation of African women in the U.S. that are going to be struggling against new forms of oppression, such as lynching and Jim Crow racism and the abuse of Black women, and struggling to build education and healthcare and job training and all these things that women like Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary McLeod Bethune and Mary Church Terrell and Maggie Walker and all these amazing African women in the U.S. Did, and in Canada, because it was all connected as well. So I love talking about Harriet Tubman. I wish I could say more, but just for the sake of time, we'll stop there. But I love this, one of the last quotes she did. She died 5 years later, where she said, "I did not take up this work for my own benefit, but for those of my race who need help. The work is now well started, and I know God will raise up others to take care of the future. All I ask is united effort. For united we stand, divided we fall." This is what Tubman said at the opening of another house that she built, Tubman's House, for African people in New York as well. So she was quoted as saying that. So we should honor Harriet Tubman. We should act more united. She knew what it took for liberation to be achieved. And she is reminding us that there's still more work to do. And if we look back at her example and her courage, then we'll know, we'll have a guidepost of how to do that. And we're dealing with an environment that is not nearly as treacherous as what she had, but yet we're somehow doing less, many of us. So we should just keep that in mind. So we'll stop there for a second and go to our first Q&A, and then we'll talk about some other Akan women. Any questions in the chat, Daniel, or any hands?
Yes, there's two questions in the chat. The first one says, were there any Sheroes that intentionally chose to not have children because they were fighting for freedom?
It's a good question. Intentionally chose to not have children. I don't have an answer to that right away, to be honest. I'd have to look that up and think more about it, because I don't have an answer right off the top of my head, but that's good. I know we have examples of enslaved African women that killed their children so they didn't have to go through enslavement. People like Margaret Garner, who the book Beloved is based off of. She had escaped with her children, and then when it looked like she was about to be caught, she said, "I'd rather just give my children back to the ancestors than have them go through the horrors of enslavement." And that happened a lot. There were a lot of abortions and a lot of not a lot, but examples of infanticide, so that children didn't have to go through the hells of enslavement. So that's happened. But intentionally not having children is something I'd have to look more into. What's the second question?
Were the brothers that returned part of the family that she was able to free later on?
Yes. She ultimately got them free. I just can't imagine what their life was like for them, like afterwards. Like, but yeah, they eventually got free. Yeah.
Miss Anderson and then Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, am I to understand that she spent her last days in New York?
Yes, upstate New York, like Auburn, upstate. There's Auburn, New York, I think is the name of the town.
Okay, I was always under the impression that it was in Canada, so this is something new I learned.
She came back. So a lot of Africans went to Canada between 1850 and the Civil War because of the Fugitive Slave Act. They went to places like St. Catherine and Chatham and Toronto. But once the Civil War was over, many of them came back because the threat of being re-enslaved was over. A lot stayed. And, we have those black towns, but many came back. So they used Canada as kind of like a place of retreat during the war. But once it was over, they came back.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning again. Unless I missed something, it appears, based on this morning's lecture, that the emancipation actually started in the United States. And to the best of my recollection, the emancipation movement started long before that in Jamaica, and then the spin-off went into the Americas and England.
Oh yes. That's just the name of that law, the Emancipation Proclamation. But in terms of the chronology, it's funny the kind of how the dominoes fall. So the English are first. The English, in terms of formal abolition, the English say, this is actually not that economically sound, so we're going to end it. And you did have English people who were fighting for the abolition of slavery for altruistic reasons, but the ultimate reason was we're moving into another form of production, capitalist production, where we could still exploit African labor. We could just exploit it as free labor and not as enslaved labor. We all these rebellions, these things. These are costing money, but if you give these people freedom, you can still exploit them, but it's more long-term economically beneficial. England understood that first, so that's why they granted emancipation into their territories. The north of the United States then started to understand that because they're industrialized a little while after England. And in the industrial north of the US, they're like, wait a minute, the South is getting all of this extra economic benefit because of all this free labor. It's kind of holding up capitalist development in the US. Let's end it. So that was the North. Again, you had the same type of mix. You had some people like the Quakers and folks, even though they had slaves earlier, who said, slavery's wrong. But then you had a whole capitalist class in the US that was like, yeah, slavery's wrong, but it's not because of all the human rights violations, because it's bad economic policy for long-term development of the United States. So that's what it was. So it goes England, the North, and then finally the South was forced to as a result of the Civil War. But even then, the South afterwards realized too, like, yeah, we could still exploit African labor and they would be free, but we'll use sharecropping, we'll use the convict lease system. We're still will get that labor, even though these people are nominally free. Same thing in the Caribbean. Nominal emancipation, but we still got the apprenticeship program, and after that, just sheer economic exploitation. So yeah, that's correct. I think Robert has a question, and then if there's Daniel, check if there's anything in the chat.
So the fact that Tubman wasn't betrayed for all that time is obviously quite shocking, and I just wanted to check. So a friend of mine said, I don't know if there's any evidence of this, but basically that Harriet Tubman said to her people, "If you betray me, I will kill you."
I mean, that's what the gun was for.
Is there any evidence of that?
I mean, that's what the gun was for. That was if you turn back, I'm going to shoot you because you're going to compromise this entire mission. So, yeah, I mean, there was no going back. But yeah, she was never, at least not on record that we have, that she was betrayed, even during her reconnaissance of areas where she was spying and doing different things. But yeah, when they were on the move, it was, we're moving. You're going to follow what I say. I've done this, so many times. I know what I'm doing. Follow my lead. I don't want to argue with you. And if we got a problem, that's what the gun is for. I used to work at a place called the Charles L. Blockson Collection in Philadelphia. And Charles L. Blockson is he's older now. I think he might be in his 90s, but he's a great collector of African and Afro-Caribbean, African-American literature, and artwork and these things. And he, at some point in his life, the National Geographic hired him to do a piece on the Underground Railroad, and he went all over. In fact, this is from. This might be from this is from the National Geographic. This might actually be from the research that Mr. Bloxon did. He actually went around the United States and found these areas where the safe houses were, and he put up the historical markers throughout the country, mapping out these routes to freedom. You see where they went. You know, it wasn't just to Canada and to the north, but to Mexico. It was free African communities in Mexico. People escaping by sea, going to Cuba, particularly to Haiti. Once Haiti got independence, it was a magnet for Africans that were able to escape and get to Haiti. But Mr. Bloxham was also at some point able to get in his collection Harriet Tubman's shawl, Harriet Tubman's gun, and Harriet Tubman's Bible. He eventually donated those things to the Smithsonian. You know, he had his own collection. He says best that these things are at the Smithsonian, and they're now in the big African American Museum in D.C. But he often talked about that. He was like, "Yeah, I'm glad that I got her gun." You know, a lot of these things are still there. All right, so we're going to move across back to Africa and back to the Ashanti Confederacy or the Ashanti Empire, whichever one we like to use. Because remember, this is the area that Harriet Tubman's ancestors come from, the area that Nanny came from, the area that Queen Akua came from in Jamaica, and so many other enslaved African women that led resistance movements. Many of them came from this region, either they directly or their ancestors. So this empire, as it grew, these people entered the slave trade as a result of the British, the Dutch being on this coast and benefiting from the state building that was happening in Africa. Fast forward to the 1800s. Slavery ends in the United States. Slavery ends in most places in the Caribbean. It's ultimately going to end in Brazil. Brazil's the last place to end slavery in 1885. And the British at the, beginning of the 1800s, and especially going toward the middle, made it a point to try to stop the transatlantic slave trade. Partially that was to weaken the U.S. at first. It was to weaken their competitors. And again, like I mentioned, they were moving into another form of capitalist production. So they wanted to end the slave trade. The Ashanti Empire had grown, and many of its subcomponents of it had grown rich because of the slave trade. So remember, this is a confederacy. So you have the central government in Kumasi, but you also have these other sub-kingdoms that sometimes go to war with each other, go to war with neighbors. Those war captives end up being taken to places like Elmina and Cape Castle and all these places to be sold into enslavement. So as a result of that, the Ashanti kingdom had a stake in the slave trade. Some of the folks that were in this kingdom, and they fought to keep the trade open at various points. And the British said, no, we're not going to do that because we've made our money from the slave trade. So now we want to move on to something else. But this empire still existed. It's grown to what you see here on this map. But so in the 1800s, the lack of revenue from the trading on the coast and enslaved people has upset some of the subpopulation, some of the subgroups of the Ashanti Grand Confederacy. So folks are losing money. Folks are also losing faith in the central rulership in Kumasi. So in the 1800s, you got a number of civil wars that happen in this area. And then even with the legitimate trade that's going on the coast with the British and the Dutch, the Ashanti Empire has another problem because there's another kingdom called the Fanti, which are here, which you see in this line here, who are starting to act as middlemen between the British, particularly the British, and the Ashanti kingdom. The Ashantis claim that everything in this area is theirs and that even the Fanti are underneath their jurisdiction. The Fanti say, no, we're an independent kingdom, and we make our own arrangements with the British so that you, the Ashanti, don't get rich or aren't able to enrich yourself with European goods without us being in the middle. So there's this friction between the Fanti and the Ashanti. So that's going on. And then inside of Ashanti itself, there's friction among the different groups, the different regional groups. So all this is happening in the 1800s. So slavery and the presence of the English and the Dutch in this region are exacerbating a lot of these conflicts, particularly in the early 1800s. Then when slavery is outlawed, it's that battle over who's going to control legitimate commerce with the British, all in this region. While all of this is going on, remember we talked about last week the Ashanti political system. So you have the Asante Hene and the Asante Hima at Kumasi, the capital. They run this kingdom that's over a bunch of other kingdoms. And they all have the same type of setup. You have the Asante Hene, remember what we said, you can only become the Asante Hene if you are related to the royal family through your mother. So the queen mother is incredibly important. Well, by the time we get to the mid 1800s, there are a lot of civil wars because a lot of the queen mothers have a lot of daughters. And then those daughters have sons. And each one of those sons of those daughters is entitled or possibly could be the next Asante Hene. So you got all of these Game of Thrones type stuff going on. So let's just talk about one that leads right into the period that we're talking about. So let's start with Queen Mother Afua Kobe. Queen Mother Afua Kobe is considered a pretty good queen mother. She takes over, and her uncle was Kwaku Dua I, who was a very autocratic ruler of the Ashanti kingdom. But he was good at it, though. But he tried to rule with absolute power. And because he had such a grip on power, when he died, a lot of people saw this as their opportunity to defy the empire. You know, you had different subgroups that said, okay, well, since he's gone, he's the big boogeyman, bad king, but we couldn't do nothing while he was alive. We want to break away. We don't want to pay taxes and tribute to Kumasi anymore. We want to be independent. Or you had different people in the royal family that want to be the next Asante Hene. So his death left a power vacuum that was eventually filled by this astute queen mother Afua Kobe and her son, who ends up becoming the next Asante Hene, Kofi Kakari, in 1867. He is dependent upon his mother for counsel, and she tries to give him the best counsel in terms of how to control the different subgroups in the Ashanti Confederation, how to control other members of the royal family that want the throne, but then also what type of relationship are we going to have with the British? Because prior to this, so this is in the 1860s, the Ashanti Empire was so powerful, they had defeated the British in several battles in the 1820s, in the 1830s, 1840s, and in the 1850s. The British, it wasn't outright domination. Oftentimes we think of colonialism that the English or the French just had such mighty military arms and military technology. They were able to just run over African kingdoms. That wasn't the case until later in the 19th century. At this point, things are pretty even, and the British don't know how to fight in the interior, where the capital of Kumasi is. This is the forest area. The British don't know how to fight here. So when the British ever made inroads from the coast to try to, buck against the Ashanti Empire, they were often soundly defeated. And the Ashanti had firearms. So throughout the 1800s, it's the Ashanti and it's the Zulu in South Africa that give the British the most trouble. These are the two kingdoms that Britain can't seem to do anything with all the way until the end of the 19th century. So, and they tried. They tried their hardest. She also has to contend with the British. So she's negotiating with the British. She is influencing her son, Kofi, who's the Asante Hene, who's the leader, about how to act. But he is really despotic. I mean, and he's not good at it like his great uncle was. His great uncle Kwaku was despotic and autocratic, but he was good at it. He could instill fear in people. He had a control over the regions. Kofi is not good at it. And ultimately, he's deposed. His mother says, "You're not a good Asante Hene. I'm deposing you for your brother." And she deposes him. And she has backing of certain generals, because this confederation is made up of the royal family, then you have generals, and then you have the sub-kings, the sub-Asante Henes, and the sub-queen mother. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of people whose allegiance that you need to cultivate. She, Afua, as a queen mother, was able to cultivate these allegiances so much so that she had her son deposed. She didn't have him killed. She just had him exiled. That's important. So Kofi Kakar is exiled. So her other son, Mensa Bonsu, takes over as the Asante Hene. He's very much like his brother. He's weak. He's ineffectual as the Asante Hene. He doesn't follow his mother's good advice. He's ineffectual. While all this is going on, her daughter, Ya'aka, is growing in power. So she's the daughter of the queen mother. She has set herself up as one of the most astute business women in the entire Ashanti Confederacy. She owns a lot of land, a lot of property. She has a lot of money. She set herself up with some good marriages. Her first husband was a descendant of one of the previous Asante Henes, and her second husband was his brother, another descendant of one of the previous Asante Henes. So she set herself up, and she knows, because she's the daughter of the queen mother, that one of her sons is in line or could possibly be the next Asante Hene. So she's prepping her sons. She's starting with Kwaku, her older son, Kwaku Dua II. And she's behind the scenes plotting against her own mother and her brothers. So her first brother taken out the scene, the mother deposed her. Mensa Bonsu comes in, he's pretty much just like his older brother. He's weak, ineffectual. So Ya'aka is working with certain generals, certain other members of the royal family, certain other leaders of sub-polities within the Ashanti Federation. And she had to scheme and gets enough support that she's able to depose her mother. So she gets her mother out the way and her brother. She has her younger brother killed. Her older brother, remember, she has her mother exiled. She doesn't kill her mother. She doesn't go that far. She deposes her mother, but she doesn't kill her mother. She has her mother exiled from Kumasi. She has her other brother hops up and he's like, "Hey, wait a minute. My mother deposed me, but I'm not letting you and your sons take over." She ends up killing him. She kills her older brother. Her son Kwaku Dua takes over. And while all this is happening, these are through wars. Fighting is occurring through all of this, weakening this empire. So the British are just sitting back watching as all this is happening. All this infighting is occurring. Kwaku Dua, she becomes queen mother after she deposes her mother. Her son becomes Asante Hene. Kwaku Dua only is Asante Hene for a year and then he dies. She has another son though, Prempeh I. The problem is this son is only 13 years old, but she has him crowned as the Asante Hene. She, in fact, goes so far as to procure the golden stool in her own personal residence so that she could always have that when she needed to crown another Asante Hene. Remember, the golden stool was the symbol of the Ashanti Empire, the Ashanti Confederation. So she has her son, 13-year-old Prempeh, installed as the Asante Hene. So she's basically running the empire. And she does so brutally. She kills a lot of people. Anybody that tries to go against her, she's really good at politics. But the problem is when she and Prempeh come to the throne, the British see this as their opportunity to really press their influence in the region. So through pretext and other things, the British, with Fanti's support, decided they're going to invade Kumasi. And they already invaded Kumasi in 1874, but they didn't occupy it. They invaded it, they burnt it down, but then they left. This time, however, they're going to force the Ashanti Empire, the Ashanti Confederation, to become a British protectorate. the way that the Fanti. So the Fanti had already, at this point, had said, you know what, we're under British protection. We'd rather be under British protection than Ashanti domination. So the Fanti said, we're a protectorate of the British. The British now want to extend that protectorate from the coast over all of this. And so they're coming up against Akya and her 13-year-old son, Prempeh, who at this point he is closer to 16. He's a little bit older, Prempeh the first. And they're able to win victory after victory after victory because the state has already been weakened from a decade, going all the way back to the 1870s. A decade of civil war, almost 2 decades really, of civil war and fighting and weakening of this empire. So when the British are ready, it's not that the British are just so much superior, it's that this kingdom is already fractured and weak. So when the British are making their advance, you got some sub-kingdoms in this region that are just like, yeah, go. We're not even going to put up any resistance because we don't like what's going on with the royal family in Kumasi and all the fighting. So yeah, go ahead. We're not even going to put resistance on your march to Kumasi. So let's see how this plays out. Daniel, would you mind playing that video? We'll watch this video, and then I'll tell you when to stop it. Then we'll talk about the experience of one of the Queen Mothers.
Culture and power sustained the Asante Kingdom, and it continued in this vein for some time. However, by the second half of the 19th century, rival Fanti rulers along the coast were increasingly keen to assert themselves and wanted to increase their control of coastal trade. Significantly by now, there was an ever-growing British presence in this part of Africa. Unable to defeat the mighty Asante themselves, the Fanti turned to the British for help. Their interests aligned. The consequences for the Asante were disastrous. In 1874, the British ransacked Kumasi. They took all its treasures, destroyed the king's stone-built palace, and then burnt down the city. The destruction lasted for well over a year. The British declared this part of Africa a crown colony and called it the Gold Coast. But the Asante Kingdom did not perish. In 1888, a new Asante king took the throne. He was Prempeh the First, and he decided he wanted to revive and preserve his kingdom. When he was offered protectorate status by the British, he responded, but Prempeh knew he could not defeat the British militarily, and he signalled he was prepared to negotiate. The British were in no mood to do so. They did not want to see the re-emergence of the strong Asante kingdom. The story of Prempeh I and photos and objects from his reign are on display at the museum in the Manhia Palace in Kumasi. Prempeh I, of course, was the Asante king who really came up against the British. How is he regarded in Asante history today?
We see him as very loyal to the kingdom. When he was installed at age 18 in 1888, because of his age, the British thought that they could manipulate him to their own good. But this king refused. So because of that, this king was deceived and was arrested by the British at age 26. He was sent to Elena Castle, Cape Coast, for 1 year.
Prempeh I was brought and kept in this room at St. George's Castle in Elmina, about 12 kilometres from Cape Coast. And from here, he was dispatched into exile to the Seychelles. Do mushrooms freak you out?
That's where he ends up, because we look at the Ashanti Kingdom as one that many of its subgroups made a lot of money off the slave trade. So the fact that its ruler ends up in one of those castles that so many Africans before had been locked up in on their way to the U.S. So this is what I talk about when I say the connection between slavery and colonialism as being truly one phenomena, because people that got rich or thought that they were doing something in the short term to get rich off their trade with the Europeans ultimately end up paying the price because everybody gets colonized. So it's like we're gonna take African people out of Africa, but eventually we're coming back to take the entire thing, with the exception of Ethiopia. But we'll get into that either next week or the week after. But the British couldn't stop there, so they kidnapped the king, even though he had surrendered. They kidnapped the queen and the queen mother, and then they make the mistake of saying, not only do we want that, but we want the golden stool. And this is when they took it too far. After the king gets kidnapped, with a bunch of the other rulers of the sub-kingdoms, like places like Ajesu. Ajesu was one of the areas that the Ashanti had become a part of the Ashanti Federation. So they have their own royal lineage. And they had a queen mother, Ya Asantewa, who was the queen mother of Ajesu. Her brother had been king, but then her grandson became the king of Ajesu. And when Prempeh the First was exiled, they also exiled her grandson. So she's at this meeting where the British governor demanded the golden stool, the symbol of the Ashanti Kingdom. So the king's already in exile. They basically won. The people don't even really want to fight. A lot of the generals and the other chiefs, they don't want to fight. But the British just have to take it that step further and say, no, we want you to present us with the golden stool so that the governor can sit on it to show that you are, in fact, conquered. And this is when, and some people were actually considering giving the governor the golden stool. Some of these chiefs were like, you know what, maybe we should just go ahead and do it. We already lost our king. We might as well go ahead and do it. This is when Ya Asantewa stands up in the meeting. Now, like I said, she's not the Asante Hima. She's not the queen mother of all of the Ashanti. She's just the queen mother of one of the subgroups. So, you know, to make a comparison, she's not the prime minister. She's the one of the, what do you call it? Yeah, she's like the premier of Manitoba. Like it's not even the premier of Ontario. It's not even one of the major provinces. But she's the premier of like Manitoba. She gets up in the meeting and she says, how could you even consider doing this? Of all of our history, all the things that we've done, how great this kingdom is, how could that thought even come into your mind? And she's talking to men, and she says, you know, men are not fences for any woman to lean against. It's like, I can't depend on any of you. And she insults them. I mean, she says, brave men of our motherland, we face serious confrontation because of this governor's insulting demand for our golden stool. We should remember that not long ago, the white man invaded our country and declared our kingdom a British protectorate. Let us not forget that this same white man set ablaze Kumasi, our seat of government, after looting all the priceless treasures bequeathed to us by our forefathers. Our king, Nana Prempeh I, was arbitrarily arrested and deported to foreign lands, together with our queen mother, Nana Ya Akaya, and our leading chiefs without anyone raising a finger. Today, the governor has come to demand for the very soul of the Ashanti of the Ashanti nation. Countrymen, shall we sit and accept humiliation by these rogues? Arise. Resist the white man whose sole purpose in our land is to steal and destroy. It is most honorable to perish in defense than to live in perpetual enslavement. I have seen that some of you fear to go forward to fight for our king. In the brave days of old, chiefs would not have watched their king being taken away without firing a shot. No white man would have dared speak to Asante chief of, oh, the way that the governor speaks to you chiefs this morning. Is it true that the bravery of Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. If you men of Ashanti won't go forward, then we women will. We will fight until the very last of us falls in the battlefield. I, Ya Santua, am prepared and ready to lead you to war. She also said, I don't have this quote, she also said, if you men don't want to fight, then I'll take your loincloth and you take my undergarments. That was the ultimate insult that she gave. Just, if you're not going to fight. So after this rousing speech, the people were like, you know what, she's right. We're going to fight. And they did. And they named her the commander-in-chief of the Ashanti forces. She provided the spiritual, the political, the moral fortification for the troops as they went out to fight against the British. She oversaw the planning of resistance and delayed British strategies. She led guerrilla warfare the same way that Nanny did in Jamaica. And they fought valiantly as best they could. But because of all that previous division that we talked about, there were still some folks that were allied with the British. It was already weakened, but they fought. And the British never got the golden stool. They never got the golden stool. She ultimately was captured and exiled to the Seychelles along with Prempeh and the others. Eventually, though, some of those leaders were brought back after the British essentially pacified the region. She wasn't, though. And another woman, Yao Awua, was made the Queen Mother of Ajeso, and then she supported the British. So a year after, they got a puppet as Queen Mother there. And even when Prempeh came back, it was really with the understanding that the British were in control. And Ghana wouldn't get independence until 1957. So not a long time after. People that were still alive in 1957 remember the rebellion that was led by Ya Santiwa. And some of the so-called chiefs that were still active in 1957 were people that either they or their fathers had been complicit with British colonization of Ghana. So when Kwame Nkrumah comes in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah doesn't come from the chiefly class of people. And there was a lot of confrontation between what Nkrumah wanted to do in Ghana in terms of his anti-imperialist, anti-neocolonialist stance, and some of these chiefs who were descendants of these chiefs that had allied with the British. And they were able to keep their position and weren't exiled alongside with Prempeh, or if they were brought back with the understanding that they wouldn't go into confrontation with the British again. So that becomes something that plays out a little bit later. But everybody in Ghana, there's nobody in Ghana that does not recognize the importance of Ya Santiwa because of what she reminded the people of their greatness. So it was very interesting. We look back at Nanny, Harriet Tubman, Queen Nakua, Ya Santiwa. All of these women challenged their communities to rise up, challenged their communities spiritually to have the courage to continue to fight these various forms of oppression. And these are all names that we should know and be proud that they came from this region and resisted, even when odds weren't in their favor, which they never were, but they fought. They fought courageously. And that's something that we should all take away in the year 2022. So we'll stop there today. Next week, and we'll look at more resistance to this growing threat of colonization in Africa. So we're going to spend a lot of time in the 1880s, 1890s, when colonization is really, and we already started talking about this. We talked about it in France, in Algeria with the French in the 1830s, and that resistance. So we're going to look at some other places. We'll look at Zimbabwe. We will look at Rwanda. We'll look at Madagascar, which is a really interesting story. And then, of course, we'll look at 1896, when the Ethiopians under Queen Taitu, Empress Taitu, are able to defeat the Italians. So we'll talk about those stories and some more next week when we reconvene. Any questions in the chat, Daniel, or any hands?
I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands right now either.
Okay. Any announcements, anything that folks want to say before we close up tonight? Okay, I think I see a hand there.
Yes, Nduta, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I just wanted to make an announcement that today at 7 p.m. there's a community consultation and engagement for safer community, and it's targeted mainly towards African, Caribbean, and Black Canadian women living in Ottawa. Actually, not just women, but the whole community. So I'll share the poster in the chat.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Anything else? Any other questions, comments, announcements? I think Robin has one in the studio. And again, people, the studio's open. Feel free to if you're free on a Saturday, you want to get out of your house, we're available. We're here, and you're free to come. So join us, Robin.
Just adding to what Sister Jackie said there, I would definitely encourage people to attend that session tonight, because it's being it's actually focused on, quote, Ottawa's gang strategy. It's led by Hefford Solutions, and so yeah, I'm attending. I think everyone should definitely attend that and see what's going on and share your opinion, because we know there have been some serious concerns raised about Hefford Solutions by us and the Hub and other people. So definitely attend that. Yeah, no. So I mean, your lectures always trigger so many thoughts, man. So the Emancipation Proclamation, you said it freed slaves unless they got locked up. Is that what I heard correctly?
No, the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved Africans in the rebellious states. Okay. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery unless you get locked up. And
gotcha,
that's still today.
Gotcha. Okay. Because that one obviously really kind of still, yeah, to this day, right? Exactly. So slavery is supposedly abolished all forms of, well, not all forms, but unless you get locked up, which of course a lot of people are still getting locked up, right? So, well, I guess I want to throw this out. So obviously these are really inspiring stories of women who, as you mentioned, encourage folks to fundamentally challenge the system. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about somebody that I think a lot of people know, and this will be a controversial opinion, I suspect, but yeah. So I think a lot of people are familiar with Jean Augustine. Okay, she was the first black woman member of Parliament. Okay, so I'd known of Jean Augustine for a while, and kind of heard her story. Her story is that she came from Grenada, worked as a domestic, became a member of Parliament, and she was the one who pushed to get Black History Month recognized. Right? So I went to there was a film actually done about her, and there was a premiere of that film a few weeks ago, and I went to it. And in the film, there's like a number of white folks praising her, including conservatives. Okay, and 100% sure that the message that seems to come through that clearly from that film is that yes, there is some discrimination done by some bad folks. There is some discrimination, but if you get an education and work hard, you can overcome it. There is no at all challenging the fundamental system of that there's systemic anti-black racism and why it's there in the whole bit. And so certainly people use her story to push that narrative, right? To stay aware. And I gotta admit, I've never heard Jean Augustine challenge that narrative.
I don't know one way or the other. Someone with more experience with the Honorable Jean Augustine will probably have a better answer for that. Yeah, I don't know one way or the other. But it is interesting. She's not the only one that narratives are created about the folks' lives to paint a picture that may or may not be accurate. I mean, the same, it's done all the time. It's done they even do it with Malcolm X, which is always the funniest thing, that like, oh yeah, Malcolm X realized toward the end that white people aren't bad, and therefore that he's sanitized now, and we can use this as yeah, like you said, some white people did some bad things, but the system itself is not bad because it allows somebody like Malcolm X to even see that, so, which is completely off. So I'm not surprised that that's done. I don't know the answer to what the Honorable Gene Augustine's critiques of systemic racism in Canada are. Somebody provided more information than me, but I'm not surprised that was done at all. I don't know if anybody in the chat knows anything about that or anything, but that's always interesting. Or anybody on the call. Daniel, anything in the chat? Not about that, but or anything?
The only thing I see in the chat, there's a question that says, where are the classes?
Where are we? We're at 235 Montreal Road. So if you go down Montreal Road, right across from the LCBO, and the cross street is Mairie. Very accessible through various forms of public transportation, as well as driving. So yeah, we're here, and yeah, feel free to join us. And just look up BIA Media as well. And there's so many resources that you can use. This is a space that's inviting the community to utilize it for your videography needs, your meetings, podcasting. So many opportunities to do so many great things here. So yeah, definitely look into the space. Look into the resources. Anything else? Is that a hand from? No, it's just thumbs up. Robert, go ahead. We have another announcement.
Well, actually, just following up on what you said about the narratives of our folks, and you mentioned Malcolm X, but there's same thing with Martin Luther King.
Oh yeah, it's even worse.
People just grab him. Everyone uses them, right? So there was I wrote a blog post a while back that hit on that idea of how the coverage of some of our videos are sanitized and changed. And one of the things that we don't hear about is this quote. Okay, so this is from Martin Luther King. And this is so when I say, yeah, as we know, people who
excuse me,
claim Martin Luther King, a lot of white liberals love him to death, right? So, but they don't use this quote. Quote: I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is an absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is an absence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Unquote.
And I think that's from a letter from the Birmingham jail,
Yeah.
which is often used in pieces, but not in full. But it's one of the great pieces of philosophy and theology that was written in the 20th century. And he wrote it in jail on the margins of newspapers and on toilet paper. He writes this letter that most people don't read anything by Dr. King anyway, but that's one of the ones that's not read. Ms. Anderson and then Anemnu, go ahead.
Yes, I just wonder the best way to access previous lectures.
The course website has all the previous lectures. So if you register for one of our courses, every course you have to register for the individual course. And it's still free, but all the lectures are there. So you'll have all the recordings from even past years that since we started recording in 2020. So I know for this week, it'll be up there, and there'll be at least 2 other videos that you could watch from week 5 of last year and week 5 of the year before.
So, can you give me the link to the course?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
If you tell me, I can search it.
I'll email it to you because I'm not near it. The way we have it set up now, I'm not near my computer. Unless, Daniel, if you have access to the course website, could you put it in the chat if you have access to it? Just put the link to the chat in there, and it should be there. Or did somebody just put it?
I think Daniel just put it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And Nimnu, go ahead.
Yes, no, I think that was the address. Did you put the link, Daniel? I think it was the address for the in-person lecture that you put.
I'm gonna put the link too. I'm just putting the name of the website as well.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So my question is what the movie Harriet, if you've seen it, and
Yeah.
your perspective on that and how it did as a community in terms of us, there's politics around supporting British actors.
Yeah, I think that's silly. To be honest, like, yeah, that whole idea that Black people in Britain can't play Black Americans, I think it's silly. I mean, it is funny though, like how Hollywood just loves British people. I mean, just in general, it's not even just Black people. It's like every white superhero is played by a British person or an Australian white person. I don't know why, but I find it funny. I don't find it problematic. But the movie could have. If the movie actually was historical, people would have thought that it was made up, because the movie doesn't highlight the fact that her brothers didn't go with her, the way that what actually happened historically. The movie doesn't highlight that. The problem I had with the movie was the Combahee River raid gets like an epilogue mention at the end, and it was so important that I thought, all right, this is an opportunity to give that more time, because everybody knows there's been a number of movies made about Harriet Tubman. I think the best one, actually, I think was the one they did in the 70s with Cicely Tyson. But everybody knows the story about the Harriet Tubman as the conductor. Very few people know the story of Harriet Tubman as the soldier and the spy. I wish more of that was discussed in that film. But yeah, I don't even. Did it do well? I don't remember the numbers with it, how it did overall. But yeah, I thought it was okay. You know,
I thought the acting was great. I just know that there was a lot of politics, at least around the African community, about that. So I don't know if it supported that. Same thing with the Nat Turner movie.
Yeah, I didn't like the Nat Turner movie at all, to be honest with you. And I was looking forward to that. And I think my level of excitement, I shouldn't have got excited for it because it's Hollywood. But like when they announced that they're making a Nat Turner movie, I said, finally, good. But then when I watched it, it's so many historical inaccuracies. Like they make it appear in the movie that Nat Turner gets radicalized to fight against enslavement because his wife was brutalized, which doesn't happen. Nat Turner was radicalized because slavery was wrong, and he had a prophetic message to end slavery. It wasn't because of his wife was brutalized. That's not. You don't need to have that to get you ready to fight against enslavement. And then the actual fighting was only, again, the last 15 minutes of the movie, which is what I thought was going to be opposite. If you're going to make a movie about Nat Turner, the bulk of the movie should be the actual revolt and rebellion, and not a movie where you spend 3/4 of it talking about how brutal slavery was. We know how brutal slavery was. This movie is supposed to be about the rebellion. So still waiting on that Haitian Revolution movie. Let's see how, because that's the one that really needs to be told.
Right.
Probably the miniseries.
Any thoughts on doing another film class?
Oh yeah. that I haven't thought about it, but I would not. I love doing it too. I love doing it. I won't be against it. So maybe in the spring. I know we're going to do in April the Malcolm and Martin again. 'Cause we didn't do it last year. We're going to do it this year, and then we have. So maybe in the summer. Because I would love to do it again. Yeah, I think about that because it is fun to do. Anything in the chat? Anything else, Daniel? I think that's it. All right. So we'll close it there today and pick up again next week. Everybody stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.